Can everybody welcome the 23 new classmates we have in here? I'm actually putting a new node in the Metaverse. So that is live streaming to 23 people out there across the world right now, and they're actually sitting right there. So some of you are probably wondering, who is this kid in front of you? I think I'm probably the youngest person in here besides Jen Lum in the back. And I'm a venture capitalist, and so every year I get to look at new technologies and focus in them. I'm also an activist investor and just did a takeover of AMD, although that's done as well. And so I wanted to talk to you about a brand new technology that's completely captured my heart, and it's VR. That said, I think there's a lot of problems going into the adoption of it. So I think it's best to frame it from this sense. Right? We went from a world that was a single dimension, right? I could interact with technology through a single line, to this interconnected web where people could put their slides up, people could put their content up, create a little mini page that demonstrated who they were. And I want to know if anybody in here has ever heard the term Metaverse. All right, digital people, I like it. Cool. So the Metaverse, for those of you guys who do not know, is actually the next dimension beyond what is a web page, right? It's creating a physical space on a digital one, right? So we're talking these people here are in the Metaverse on a node that we've just put in this classroom. But the reality is I could be joining from Jakarta. We could have other people coming in from Spain and Italy and wherever they are, all in what is a realistic classroom that looks like this. You turn your head right or left, as they may be doing now in their VR headsets, and it looks like they're actually right here, right? And so that, to me, opens up a lot of opportunities, both in terms of what is the new form factor, right? We shouldn't be, you've been consuming everything your whole life in this kind of weird little screen rectangle. That's a rectangle. We've consumed every digital piece of content in this 2D form factor. Imagine you add a whole extra dimension to that. And that's where I think it actually gets really interesting. Because if you think of it, right, you can read anything on a two-dimensional surface at about 3 words per minute, right? You're consuming an article. Now, think about it, right? If you have an image, what's an image worth? About 1,000 words, right? Talk about that at 60 frames per second, and then you do 100 screens in your periphery, and you're in an actual information-dense environment. And to me, that's pretty interesting because the amount of experience you can have, the amount of ways you can interact with technology is fundamentally different. That said, while it's incredible opportunity and there are thousands of things you could do, the entire business models are being reinvented on the internet, right? So think of if you're in a digital classroom right now and I'm holding a Dasani water, maybe that's because Steve is a Dasani user and this is just a white label thing and Dasani or Pellegrino or whoever could be putting in their ad in this digital physical space, right? So you have entire reinvention of the way we think of monetization business models. But the reality is there's no units out there. There's no business model yet. There's no developers really to create it. And so that's what I want to talk about. I want to have you guys also help me with any challenges that you're seeing in the adoption of this, because everybody comes from a different perspective, right? Number one, I believe the technology is completely out of reach for a lot of people, right? We're talking $3,000 for the quality headsets that those 23 people are using right now. And the reality is that there's lower end headsets that could be coming from these phone manufacturers, but they're really bad, to be honest. They're just low quality. And that's the part that really bothers me is that people's first interaction with VR is really bad. And I'd be curious, who's actually done a high-end VR experience? How many of you liked it? All right, cool. And I think the reality is there's not many places to try it, right? The Sutherland Lab over here at Harvard has a few units. You could maybe go to a Microsoft store, or you could go to one of the new VR arcades that are popping up. The economics don't really make sense, but it could be interesting. Or you could, go to a brand experience. Audi now has these new interesting experiences. Anywhere you're going to have a digital showroom, right, when you're buying that new car, you can see the color and the stitching and however you want to see it, and they don't have to take any inventory risk on that. Yet you get all of the experience of it. So I think the next interesting part is, who knows how to program HTML in here? Okay. How many of you know how to create a 3D mini universe or environment? It does. To some extent, it does. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of good proxies to it. So that's actually a significant challenge, right? There's no schools for people to learn any of this, right? It's an entirely differentiated skill set. It's the people who are animators, of which have been all gobbled up by these, Pixars and others of the world. And there's just not many places to go learn VR development. I teach a class here at Harvard on development in Unity, although it's kind of a nights and weekends fun project on the side. And I think most of the developers are actually few and scattered between. There's little studios here and there, but there's no cross-learning across them. And third, here's the real problem. There's really not many business models yet. Does anybody know what the very top grossing VR application was last year and how much they made? So it was a thing called Job Simulator, where you can actually train to do jobs in virtual reality. They made $3 million in 2016. Now, as a venture capitalist, that kind of scares the crap out of me, because $100-some billion or more have been invested in the last year. And so there's new forms of business models being created, but it's yet to be figured out. And the reality is the interoperability between a lot of systems, very much to kind of the closed wall ecosystems or the walled gardens, there's very limited interoperability. It's the same thing we saw in Android and iPhone and all of the things before that, is you have to develop for a lot of things, maybe not like the web. And so there's a lot of initiatives to go and create a more open universe as well. So with that, I would love to ask you guys if there's anything else kind of holding up your adoption. Any thoughts? Jason?
I have to buy a computer as well as a headset.
Yeah, which is probably, $2,000+ plus. NVIDIA's made a real killing, and that was kind of our thesis on investing in AMD too. Yeah.
What's the real need?
Interesting. Yeah, I think you need a killer use case, a reason to get it, or have somebody who's even facilitating that transaction, who's going to buy the headset and has some way to get increased utilization. Even myself as an adopter and a lover of it, very, very few people are interacting in it. And it actually has the same problems as like a fax machine, right? One of the possibilities is that we have social VR, right? And it increases the utility of me using it. The reality is that there's very few units out there, and a fax isn't useful until there's other units out there. Steve?
Two things. Number one, the nausea problem still hasn't been resolved. Mm-hmm. And two is us old timers, we've been through this before.
Yeah.
We lived this in the early 90s.
Exactly.
So jaded.
Yeah. So I would conject that it's actually here this time. But that said, I think it's going to go through another cycle as well. And I think there's future problems too, and we can talk about those in the breakout session. Thanks, everybody.